In the heart of the American Midwest sits a town that still looks borrowed from a postcard. Two-car driveways, trimmed hedges, mailboxes painted the color of optimism. If you drove through Meadowbrook on a summer afternoon, you'd smell barbecue smoke and hear sprinklers tick across perfect lawns. Among those rows of comfort stood number 47 Maple Lane, the Carter House. A white fence, blue shutters, a flag that never missed a holiday. Neighbors waved. The Carters waved back. To them, it was the kind of home people envied. To Nancy, it was the one place on earth she wished the wind would blow away. At 15, she already understood what most adults refused to see, that a house can smile on the outside and scream on the inside. She walked to school every day with her headphones in, pretending the music drowned out more than just silence. Teachers called her quiet, polite, a model student. No one asked why her hands sometimes trembled when the intercom buzzed suddenly. Nancy had learned how to vanish without leaving, to keep her voice even, her eyes dry, her footsteps light. It was survival disguised as good behavior. In towns like Meadowbrook, the voice continues. Trouble doesn't knock, it whispers, and people would rather turn up the television than ask what they heard. By evening, the lights on Maple Lane all clicked on in near-perfect synchronization. From the street, the Carter living room glowed warm and ordinary. Inside, the air felt colder. Nancy sat on the staircase, tracing the pattern of the carpet with her finger, counting breaths until she could slip away to her room. She listened, always listening, for the tone of voices behind closed doors. When laughter sounded wrong, she knew to stay invisible. Every survivor remembers the moment when fear stops being surprise and becomes routine. For Nancy, that moment came long before she turned 16. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson watered her roses, unaware of anything unusual. The neighbors weren't villains. They were simply comfortable. Comfort, Nancy had learned, could blind a person faster than darkness ever could. By the time Nancy turned 16, the smile she wore in public had calcified into armor. She'd stopped waiting for anyone to notice. Instead, she watched and listened, learning how adults lied, how the world moved, and how freedom always began with a plan. She got a part-time job at the diner on Highway 9, claiming she wanted experience. In truth, she wanted distance. The job gave her cash, small bills, tips she hid in a sock under her bed. It gave her an excuse to stay out late. It gave her time to think. One evening, while wiping down the counter, the cook, an older man named Ray, asked, "You ever plan on getting out of this town, kid?" Nancy hesitated. "Someday." Ray chuckled. "Everybody says that. Then they blink and they're 50, still here." Nancy looked out the window at the dark highway stretching endlessly beyond the neon sign. "I won't blink," she said quietly. She started keeping essentials in a backpack under her bed. A toothbrush, one change of clothes, the notebook of addresses, and a bus schedule. No one noticed. Her mother had long since stopped asking questions. Her stepfather was too wrapped in his own authority to see anything he didn't want to see. On a humid August night, she made her move. The air smelled like rain and gasoline. Everyone in the house was asleep or pretending to be. She slipped out the back door barefoot, shoes tied around her neck by the laces. The screen door creaked once. Her heart nearly stopped. Then silence. For some, escape is an act of courage. For Nancy, it was survival, and a promise that one day, no one would ever control her again. She walked 3 miles along the shoulder of the highway, her shadow stretching long under the flickering streetlights. When the 2:10 a.m. bus rumbled by, she lifted her hand. The driver slowed, surprised to see a teenager standing alone in the dark. She climbed aboard without looking back. The bus hissed and pulled away, leaving Meadowbrook behind like a photograph fading in the rain. Nancy Carter vanished that night. To the neighbors, she was just another runaway. To investigators years later, she would become something far more complicated, a ghost with a motive. She rode until sunrise, head against the window, watching cornfields blur into city lights. She didn't know where she was going, only that anywhere was better than where she'd been. When the bus stopped in Chicago, She stepped off with $42 to her name and a heartbeat that finally belonged to her. Freedom, she would later say, doesn't feel like flying. It feels like falling. But knowing the ground is yours when you hit it. That's how Nancy's first life ended, and her second began. Every runaway has two names. The narrator begins over the low hum of a city bus engine, the one she leaves behind, and the one she invents to stay alive. Nancy chose her new name the first week she arrived in Chicago. She told anyone who asked that she was Anna. Shorter, simpler, easier to forget. In a city of millions, anonymity was freedom. She rented a room in a rundown hostel on the south side, the kind where the wallpaper peeled like old skin and the halls always smelled faintly of bleach. Her neighbors were strangers. A waitress, a student, a man who never spoke but always locked his door twice. For the first time, no one knew her story, and that anonymity felt like oxygen. She found work at a laundromat. Cash pay. No questions. She scrubbed other people's clothes by day and studied their faces by night. The way exhaustion shaped them, how desperation made people predictable. Nancy was learning the rules of survival in a new kind of jungle. But peace never lasts. Trauma, the narrator says, has a strange way of following silence. Even in a crowd, it whispers the same name. Nancy started waking at 3:17 every night, the exact minute she'd stepped on that midnight bus. The nightmares blurred memory and imagination. Sometimes she saw her stepfather's face in reflections, her stepbrother's voice tangled with passing sirens. She started running literally. Each dawn, she jogged along the riverfront, pushing her lungs until the memories faded behind her heartbeat. The city became her witness, and slowly, she stopped being a runaway and started being something else. One morning, she met a woman named Dora, a former Marine who ran a small self-defense gym. Dora saw something familiar in Nancy, the stare of someone who'd lived through too much. She offered her a free class. Nancy accepted. That decision, the narrator intones, wasn't about fitness. It was the first step toward control and eventually vengeance. Nancy trained relentlessly. Days at the laundromat, nights at the gym. Her small frame hid strength she hadn't realized she had. She learned to disarm, to strike, to read people's movements before they made them. Dora never pried into her past. But one night, as they locked up, she said softly, "You don't move like someone who's just trying to stay safe. You move like someone who's preparing for something." Nancy met her eyes. "Maybe I am." Dora nodded. "Just make sure you survive whatever that something is." That sentence stayed with her. 10 years had passed since she left Meadowbrook. She was 25 now, quiet, composed, unrecognizable. But news travels strange paths. A local report flashed one evening on the TV at the gym. Former contractor Edward Carter dies suddenly at 54. Nancy froze. The man she'd feared most was gone. The room seemed to spin, her body torn between relief and something darker. Revenge is a fire that doesn't go out just because one match burns out, the narrator says quietly. For Nancy, the flame had already spread. The face of another name rose in her memory. Evan, the brother who had never been punished. The one who'd stayed silent and sometimes worse. That night, Nancy sat by the window, the city lights blinking like Morse code. She opened her old notebook, the one she'd carried since 15, and flipped to a page she hadn't touched in years. 5 names, written in faded pencil. She picked up a pen and traced over them slowly, one by one. "Justice," she whispered, "is just order restored." And for the first time in years, she smiled. That was the moment, the narrator concludes, when Nancy Carter, the girl who ran away, began to die, and something else entirely took her place. 10 years after vanishing, Nancy Carter returned to the place that made her disappear. The narrator begins over a slow aerial sweep of the old suburb. But she wasn't the same girl. She was a question that no one in Meadowbrook was prepared to answer. Nancy drove through the town limits at dusk, windows down, letting the familiar humidity sting her skin. The streets looked smaller. Maple Lane looked exactly the same, except for the "for sale" sign tilting in front of the house that once held her captive. She parked 2 blocks away and watched the porch light flicker on as if it recognized her. Her pulse didn't quicken. It slowed, steady, deliberate. She'd trained for years to feel nothing. That discipline was her weapon now. From her car, she saw a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, older but still watering her roses. Pause, squint, and almost recognize her. Nancy turned her face slightly away. She wasn't ready to be seen. For predators, time erases their guilt. For survivors, time sharpens it into purpose. The narrator notes. That night, she checked into a motel outside town under the name Anna Keene. She unpacked carefully. Burner phone, notebook, photos printed from old social media archives, and a map of Meadowbrook pinned with red marks. 5 pins in total. Nancy's first targets weren't random. Each name had been carved into her memory since she was 17. People who had hurt her, used her, or looked away when she begged for help. Now they were back in her orbit. Her stepbrother Evan still lived nearby, working at an auto shop. He had a wife now, a child. A whole new life that pretended the old one never happened. Nancy watched from a distance for days, learning his routine. She never approached, never flinched, just observed. At night, she would stand under the motel's buzzing fluorescent light, replaying his smile in her mind. The fake one, the one he used on the world. And every night, she whispered the same line to herself. People forget what they bury. I don't. Vengeance, the narrator says, isn't born overnight. It's engineered. Nancy's skills had evolved far beyond survival. Years of training, years of study. She'd learned about psychology, surveillance, forensics, everything she'd need to become the kind of ghost the law could never catch. It wasn't rage that drove her now. It was precision. She rented a storage unit outside the city, her base of operations. Inside, she kept documents, disguises, and carefully cataloged information on each of her 5 names. She called it the archive. But vengeance has a heartbeat, and it grows louder the closer you get. Dora, her old mentor from the gym, began to notice Nancy's absences. When she asked where Nancy had been, Nancy just smiled. Tying up old ends, she said. Dora frowned but didn't press further. Later, she would wish she had. It happened one evening in late October. Nancy was at a grocery store on the edge of town when she heard a familiar laugh behind her. Evan, pushing a cart, phone in hand, telling a joke to his son. That same voice, older, but unchanged, cracked open every wall she'd built inside herself. She froze. Then she turned. He didn't recognize her at first. She looked different. Colder, sharper, the innocence gone from her eyes. But when she said softly, "Hey, Evan," his face drained of color. Recognition is a dangerous thing, the narrator murmurs. It connects past and present in a single, fatal heartbeat. He stammered something, half question, half disbelief. Nancy only smiled. Not cruelly, just calmly, and said, "You remember me. That's all that matters." Then she walked away, leaving him shaking in the aisle. The seed of fear she'd planted would do the rest. That night, Nancy returned to the motel, closed the door, and crossed out the first name in her notebook. Her pen didn't shake. She stared at the ink for a long moment, then whispered, "One down." For 10 years, the narrator closes, Nancy Carter had been running from her past. Now she was running toward it. And the people of Meadowbrook had no idea that their quiet little town was about to become the stage for something far darker than they could imagine. 3 weeks after that encounter in the grocery aisle, Nancy Carter had turned fear into fuel. She spent her days in plain sight. Morning jogs, coffee at the same diner, polite smiles that never reached her eyes. By night, she returned to the archive, the rented storage unit that had become both war room and confession booth. Strings of red twine connected faces and addresses. Dates, patterns, timing. Each pin was a piece of choreography. Each note, a rehearsal. She wasn't improvising. She was executing a schedule. Psychologists call it displacement, the narrator says. But Nancy called it equilibrium, balancing the scales. Her stepbrother Evan had grown uneasy since their brief encounter. Co-workers noticed he jumped at sudden noises. His wife said he barely slept. No one connected it to the woman he'd run into. No one asked. Nancy began leaving faint traces around his world. A postcard of their childhood street slipped under his car wiper. A song he hadn't heard in years suddenly added to his work playlist by an anonymous user. A phone call with silence on the other end. Nothing illegal. Nothing traceable. Just enough to make him look over his shoulder. Fear, the narrator murmurs, isn't always delivered in a scream. Sometimes it's a whisper that never goes away. Late one Friday, police responded to an accident on the outskirts of Meadowbrook. A car had left the road, hit a tree, and burst into flame. Inside, one occupant, later identified as Evan Carter. Preliminary findings pointed to fatigue, alcohol, and speed. The report was closed within 48 hours. No evidence of foul play, the detective said at the press briefing. A tragedy, nothing more. But among locals, the story grew its own roots. Some whispered he'd been seeing things, claiming a woman from his past was following him. Others said stress had finally caught him. Either way, the town moved on. All except one person. Detective Laura Keene, a 30-year veteran of the county sheriff's office, didn't like coincidences. 2 years earlier, she'd reviewed an old missing person file. Nancy Carter, runaway, presumed dead. Now she was staring at a death certificate carrying the same last name. She visited the crash site herself. The guardrail was intact, the road straight. It didn't look like a place for accidents. When she asked for witness statements, the patrolman shrugged. Just a quiet night, ma'am. No one saw a thing. Keene scribbled a note. Find the sister. But the sister, as far as official records went, didn't exist. In a small motel room 40 miles away, Nancy watched the evening news. The headline read, "Local man dies in single vehicle crash." She didn't flinch. She simply folded the newspaper once, placed it into the archive, and crossed out the first red mark. To outsiders, the narrator concludes, it was a random accident. To Nancy, it was symmetry. That night, she took a walk through the quiet parking lot. Rain falling soft and steady. Her reflection in the puddles looked calm, almost serene. For the first time, she felt something like peace, thin, temporary, but real. But peace built on secrets. The voice fades, never lasts long. And Detective Keene was already tracing footprints Nancy thought she'd erased. The camera drifts upward, neon motel sign flickering, siren wailing faintly somewhere in the city, and the screen fades to black. Keene spread the papers across her desk. The missing person report, the runaway notice, a high school photo. Next to it, a fresh autopsy file, Evan Carter, deceased. Brother and sister, 12 years apart. One vanished, one dead. She drew a circle around their names, then another around the small town of Meadowbrook. Inside those circles, she felt a pulse, faint but steady. Coincidences bothered her. Patterns terrified her. She requested the old files from storage. When the clerk raised an eyebrow, she only said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in unfinished stories." Nancy had moved again. Different motel, different name, same discipline. She kept her appearance subdued. Hair darker, posture straighter, eyes unreadable. Chicago was now her background noise. Meadowbrook, her unfinished sentence. She spent mornings volunteering at a shelter under the alias Anna Keene. The coincidence of the surname made her smile, as if fate had a sense of irony. People saw a woman trying to help. No one saw the calculation behind her calm. Predators hunt with hunger, the narrator observes. Survivors hunt with memory. At night, Nancy listened to police frequencies through a small radio app. She didn't know that one of the voices on those channels, Laura Keene, was already listening for her. Back in the precinct, Keene began building a wall. Photos, timelines, addresses. 5 unexplained incidents across the county in the last 18 months. Accidents, disappearances, sudden relocations. Different names, same fingerprints of coincidence. She found one image, a blurry CCTV frame from a service station camera near Evan Carter's crash site. A woman fueling a car. The timestamp matched the night of the accident. No license plate visible. The face turned away. Still, something about the posture caught Keen's eye. Shoulders slightly tense, head tilted, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Detectives chase details, the narrator says quietly. But some details chase back. One afternoon, Keen visited Meadowbrook's old diner to re-interview locals. A waitress mentioned a quiet woman who'd come through recently. Polite, solitary, ordered black coffee and left generous tips. She'd signed the receipt A. Keen. The detective froze mid-note. Her own surname stared back at her. Coincidence? The waitress asked. Maybe, Keen replied. But I don't believe in those. Later, she sat in her car outside the diner, replaying security footage. There it was again, the slight tilt of the head, the calm focus. Keen felt that faint thrill investigators get when the pattern begins to move. That night, Nancy sensed the shift. She couldn't explain it. Just the intuition that someone new was on the board. She looked at her map, added a new pin, and labeled it simply, unknown. Every predator eventually meets a mirror. The narrator closes. Laura Keen was that mirror. Disciplined, relentless, and already closing the distance. What neither woman knew was that they were building the same story from opposite sides. The screen fades to black, leaving the sound of two breaths. One calm, one determined, blending into the hum of the city. Keen sat in her office surrounded by printouts. 5 cases, 5 men. Different towns, different years. Each death ruled accidental. But the timing, the geography, too precise. She drew connecting lines on a map, the pencil trembling slightly as the shape emerged. A slow spiral circling back toward Meadowbrook. She whispered to herself, "Whoever you are, you're coming home." Nancy woke before dawn, the same hour she'd escaped all those years ago. The motel's air conditioner rattled. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and faded. She'd been careful, too careful to leave traces, but a new unease had crept in. The feeling that someone else was now watching the watcher. At the shelter that morning, she noticed a police cruiser idling across the street. Different county, wrong jurisdiction. Yet she recognized the instinct behind the stakeout, the stillness of people trained to wait. Paranoia, the narrator says, is the tax survivors pay for control. That night she returned to her storage unit and began dismantling the archive. Photos burned, papers shredded, the map folded into a single envelope. But as she reached for her notebook, the original from her teens, she hesitated. It was the only proof of who she had been. She couldn't destroy that. Not yet. Dora found her first. The former Marine walked into the shelter unannounced, older now, still grounded. She smiled when she saw Nancy. "You dropped off the face of the earth," Dora said. "I figured you either joined a monastery or you're running from something." Nancy forced a half-smile. "Maybe both." They shared coffee in the small break room. Dora studied her friend's face. The calm surface, the eyes that never stayed still. "Whatever you're doing, Anna, you can stop," Dora said quietly. "You don't have to keep fighting ghosts." Nancy's reply was barely above a whisper. "Some ghosts don't stop unless you make them." Dora didn't push further. She just slid a card across the table, her phone number, and left. Nancy stared at it long after she was gone. At headquarters, Keen's partner walked in with a folder. "Traffic cam footage from Route 11, he said. "Woman matching our mystery subject. Same car seen near 2 other incidents." Keen enlarged the grainy image. The face was turned away, but the shape of the jawline, the posture, identical to the diner footage from Meadowbrook. She wrote one line in her notebook, "She's alive." For detectives, proof is a heartbeat, the narrator intones. And Laura Keen had just found hers. That evening, Nancy stood on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the city. Below her, headlights flowed like a river of light, each car going somewhere, everyone chasing something. She thought of Dora's words, of the detective whose name she'd unknowingly borrowed. of the life she could have lived if the world had been kinder. She took the old notebook from her bag, tore out the first page, the one listing the names, and let it drift into the wind. "Let them chase the echo," she murmured. "The sound's all that's left." As the page disappeared into the darkness, the narrator closes. Two women now followed the same trail for different reasons. One seeking justice, the other peace. And between them stood the past, whispering to both. The camera pans up to the city skyline, the wind rising until it drowns every other sound. Detective Laura Keene spread half a dozen surveillance stills across her table. Each photo caught the same anonymous woman from a slightly different angle, refueling her car, leaving a motel, volunteering at a shelter. The time-stamped years formed a trail like breadcrumbs scattered across a decade. When the facial recognition software returned a near-match Nancy Carter, missing since 2005, Keene felt her pulse quicken. She whispered the name aloud, as if summoning a ghost back into the room. "You didn't die," she said softly. "You just learned how to disappear." Nancy's routine had become ritual. Mornings at the shelter, evenings cleaning offices under another alias, nights spent cataloging the city's undercurrents, which streets were watched, which weren't. But the rhythm was changing. She could feel it. The shelter supervisor approached her one morning. "Detective came by asking about you. Said she was investigating grant fraud." Nancy smiled evenly. "I'm sure it's a mistake." She finished her shift but never clocked out. By dusk she'd moved her few possessions to a new location. A sublet apartment with no lease, paid in cash. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, whispered her own name for the first time in years. "Nancy Carter," she said. "Still here." Keene drove to Meadowbrook again, retracing the road where Nancy had last been seen at 15. She visited the overgrown lot where the Carter house once stood. Neighbors said it burned years ago. They remembered the silence more than the fire. Inside the ashes of old case files, Keene found one overlooked document, a juvenile therapy note written by a school counselor. Subject exhibits hypervigilance, detachment, possible trauma response. The note ended with a line that struck her. She says she feels safest when no one can see her. "So you made the world forget you?" Keene murmured, folding the paper. "But someone always remembers." At a late-night diner, Keene met Dora, the ex-Marine. The detective slid a photo across the counter. "You know her?" Dora hesitated, eyes narrowing. "What's she done?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Keene replied. "She's using your last name." Dora gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "Of course she is." She never could resist irony. Dora's voice softened. "If you find her, don't go in hot. She's not dangerous the way you think. She's complicated." Keene nodded, noting the tremor in the older woman's hand. "Complicated," she repeated, as if testing the word's weight. That night, Nancy walked past a storefront window and paused. The glass caught her reflection and, for a fleeting second, showed another face beside hers. Keene's, projected from a TV news segment inside the shop. Detective Laura Keene reopens cold case of missing teen. "The mirror doesn't lie," the narrator whispers, "but it doesn't tell the whole truth either." Nancy turned away before the broadcast finished. She disappeared into the moving crowd, one reflection fading into another. Above, a billboard flickered with static, an advertisement for a new true crime documentary. The tagline read, "Some stories refuse to stay buried." The camera lingers on the glass as the two faces, detective and fugitive, merge in reflection. Soon, the narrator concludes, each will discover that catching the other means confronting herself. Fade to black. Detective Laura Keene stood before a small task force briefing room, the walls lined with photos and timelines. Her presentation was methodical. 5 deaths, 1 missing girl, and a web of coincidences that pointed to Anna Keene, the alias Nancy had been using. "We're not arresting her," Keene told her team. "We're drawing her out. She's cautious, maybe paranoid, but she's not reckless. If she believes she's being watched, she'll surface on her own terms." She slid a file across the table. Inside, a fabricated news story, to be quietly leaked online, about a confidential informant claiming to have evidence in one of the Meadowbrook deaths. Let's see if our ghost still reads the news. Nancy saw the article 2 days later. It appeared buried inside a crime blog she occasionally monitored, an update on a case she thought erased. Her stomach tightened. The phrasing was deliberate, taunting. Authorities close to a breakthrough in the Carter case. "You're not close," she whispered to the empty room. "You're guessing." Still, she knew what it meant. Someone had reopened the past. She returned to her storage locker, the one she hadn't fully cleared. Inside were fragments of her old life. A faded school ID, a photo of her and her mother, and a map folded into fourths. She traced one name with her fingertip. Keene. She understood now that the hunter's patience was ending. The shelter where Nancy had volunteered was chosen as the stage for the next move. A detective posing as a reporter arrived, asking about Anna Keene and her volunteer history. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, requesting anyone with information to contact the police. Nancy knew it wasn't random. It was invitation. That evening, she slipped back into the shelter after closing hours. The lights were dim. Only the sound of a ticking wall clock broke the silence. She retrieved a small box from her locker. Nothing incriminating, just mementos, letters, and an old photo of Dora. "They're not after proof," she murmured. "They're after me." Keene watched from an unmarked car across the street. Her earpiece crackled with updates from surveillance inside the building. "She's in. Alone. No sign of distress." Keene gripped the steering wheel, torn between duty and empathy. This wasn't a simple fugitive. This was a woman built from tragedy and silence. But procedure was procedure. She ordered her team to hold position. Then the lights inside the shelter flickered once, twice, and went out completely. Static filled the comms. "We lost visual," an officer said. Keene stepped out of the car, heart racing. Inside, the box Nancy had taken was gone, replaced with a single folded note. In neat handwriting, it read, "You can't catch what already confessed." At the bottom, a line added in darker ink, "Stop digging, or we both drown." Every chase changes both the hunter and the hunted. The narrator closes. Nancy sat on a rooftop across the city, watching police cars swarm the shelter below. Her phone buzzed an unknown number. She let it ring out, then saved the contact under a single letter L. "If you want me," she said quietly to the skyline, "find me the right way." Back in her car, Keene read the note again under the dashboard light. She could feel the intelligence behind it, the pain disguised as precision. "She's not running," Keene whispered. "She's waiting. Subscribe and like for next season."